In the quiet hills of Pennsylvania, 1823, a small town entrusted its dead to one family. They buried fathers, cradled infants in coffins, and promised comfort to grieving widows. But in the shadows of their parlor, beneath the scent of embalming fluids and smoke from oil lamps, something unspeakable stirred. Not all bodies were laid to rest. Not all families ever saw their loved ones again. Because the funeral home was not a sanctuary of mercy. It was a slaughterhouse. The town of Mill Forge was a farming settlement of no more than 400 souls. Life was defined by cycles: harvest, prayer, death. And death came often in the 1820s. Fevers, childbirth, accidents in the fields. People needed a family to tend to grief with dignity. The Kesslers stepped forward. Johann Kessler, a German immigrant, opened his funeral home at the edge of the woods. His wife, Margarethe, and their 3 children ran it with eerie precision. They spoke softly at funerals, sang hymns with perfect restraint, and wore black as though mourning was stitched into their very skin. The church praised them. The town relied on them. But the Kesslers were more than undertakers. They were gatekeepers of every corpse, every widow's weeping, every orphan's fate. And in that unchecked trust, evil found its sanctuary. Old diaries later recovered spoke of strange rituals inside the funeral parlor. Priests noticed Johann's children humming unfamiliar hymns during service, songs that bent Latin scripture into unholy refrains. Widows claimed Margarethe comforted them with words that sounded more like incantations than prayers. Yet no one dared speak too loud. For in Mill Forge, death was constant, and the Kesslers were necessary. No one wanted to believe the very hands folding their loved ones into coffins could also be the hands that took life away. But silence is the soil where corruption grows deepest. By 1825, Mill Forge had seen a rash of disappearances. Children from the church-run orphanage, already fragile and voiceless, would vanish in the night. The priest explained it away. Runaways, he claimed, lost in the woods. But the town began whispering another theory, that the Kesslers took them. The family had a way of appearing whenever death touched youth. They offered their services free of charge for the destitute, for the forgotten. The children's bodies were never shown at funerals, their coffins nailed shut before mourners could glimpse inside. No one questioned it, because no one dared. Years later, fragments of testimony revealed what no living neighbor was supposed to know. Beneath the Kessler home was a cellar, sealed with iron locks. Locals remembered strange sounds at night. Moaning, chains scraping, something alive struggling under the floorboards. One farmer swore he saw Margarethe descend with a lantern, and when she lifted the trapdoor, warm mist rose from below, as though the earth itself was exhaling. He tried to tell the priest. The priest told him to hold his tongue. In Mill Forge, God's order was silence, and silence protected the Kesslers. Every funeral was a performance. The Kesslers wept convincingly beside widows, touched children's shoulders with a practiced gentleness. But behind closed doors, their trade was not grief, it was anatomy. Johann was said to carve the bodies, studying organs with a surgeon's obsession. The children assisted, their hands steady, unshaken by blood. Some whispered they sold the flesh to traveling doctors. Others claimed darker motives, that the Kesslers believed consuming fragments of the dead could preserve life. In either case, the business of mourning had become a theater of control, with the family feeding both hunger and profit in secret. No family should have risen so high without suspicion. Yet the local parish not only trusted the Kesslers, it protected them. Priests spoke of their devotion during sermons, painting the family as chosen vessels of God's will. But letters hidden in church archives, found long after, tell another story. They describe donations the Kesslers made, gifts of coin, land, and even human remains. The clergy were not blind. They were bound. To expose the Kesslers would have meant exposing the rot inside their own house of worship. So they buried the truth one body at a time. It was not a man who first broke the silence, but a widow. Her name was Eliza Crane. When her husband died suddenly of fever, she brought him to the Kesslers, but she demanded an open casket. Johann refused. He insisted the fever had disfigured the body. She did not believe him. In the days that followed, Eliza claimed to hear her husband's voice calling from the woods near the funeral home. When she begged the priest for help, he denounced her as grief-mad. Yet her story spread, igniting an unease that even the Kesslers could not entirely suppress. In the autumn of 1827, a boy thought lost returned to Mill Forge. His name was Caleb Wren, barely 10 years old, pale and mute. He had vanished from the orphanage months earlier, presumed dead. One morning, he staggered from the tree line near the Kessler home, barefoot and bloodied. When townsfolk gathered him, they found his tongue had been cut away. His arms bore incisions, stitched crudely as though someone had practiced surgery on him. Caleb's silence spoke louder than words. He pointed toward the Kessler parlor, trembling, before collapsing into fits. By nightfall, he was dead. After Caleb's burial, a black ledger was rumored to have surfaced. A stable hand, who sometimes worked at the Kessler property, claimed to have stolen a glance inside Johann's study. The book contained names of the dead, with notes beside them: lungs intact, infant liver, eyes removed. This was no record of burials, it was an inventory, a catalogue of human parts tracked like grain or cattle. The stable hand fled the town soon after revealing this, but his words spread like wildfire. Still, the parish dismissed it as gossip. Fear had become a leash on every throat in Mill Forge. By 1828, the woods behind the Kessler home glowed at night. Locals described pillars of smoke rising from hidden pyres, the stench of burning meat drifting into their fields. When confronted, Johann calmly explained he was disposing of diseased tissue. His answer satisfied the priest, but not the farmers who watched carrion birds circle overhead. Children began waking from nightmares of figures in black chanting by firelight. Livestock grew skittish, refusing to graze near the property. The town lived in denial, but its soil and air were saturated with rot. The fires spoke a truth no sermon could silence. Among the Kessler children, the youngest, Anna, disturbed people most. Only 12 when whispers began, she carried herself with the cold confidence of an adult. At funerals, she would lean close to grieving children and whisper things that made them weep harder. Some claimed she could mimic the voices of the dead, speaking to widows in tones identical to their lost husbands. One villager swore he saw her dragging a sack through the churchyard late at night, leaving stains of blood across the grass. Anna never denied it. When confronted, she smiled, a smile too practiced, too ancient for a child. The town priest, Father Wilhelm, could no longer endure his silence. In letters found years later, he confessed to hearing chanting under the floorboards when visiting the Kessler home, and seeing Margarethi's hands soaked in blood as she emerged from the cellar. But Wilhelm was trapped. He wrote that Johann threatened to expose the church's own sins: orphans sold into servitude, money laundered through the parish. If the priest revealed the truth, both church and town would crumble. In the end, Wilhelm collapsed during Mass, foaming at the mouth, clutching a scrap of paper scrawled with the words, "The dead do not sleep here." In the spring of 1829, heavy rains washed away part of the hillside near the Kessler property. Children playing in the mud found bones jutting from the soil, small bones, fragile as twigs. When the townsfolk dug further, they uncovered dozens of shallow graves. Johann explained the remains as paupers' burials, claiming the church could not afford proper coffins. But mothers recognized scraps of fabric, dolls, lockets that once belonged to their children. The town trembled, yet still, no one acted. Fear had congealed into paralysis. The Kesslers were too entangled with the parish, too powerful to confront directly. Later that year, a stranger arrived in Mill Forge. He was a physician from Philadelphia, claiming to study rural death practices. He asked to tour the funeral home. For days he was seen in Johann's company inspecting tools, paging through ledgers. And then, just as suddenly, he vanished. His horse was found wandering near the woods. His belongings lay untouched at the inn. The Kesslers assured the townsfolk he had returned to the city. But a maid whispered that she saw Margarethi dragging a man's boot down the parlor stairs. No body was ever recovered. By 1830, Mill Forge was no longer merely suspicious, it was terrified. On one moonless night, multiple households awoke to screams carried by the wind. The sound was raw, human, unending. Some claimed it lasted an hour, others swore it went on until dawn. No one left their homes. Doors were barred, prayers muttered. In the morning, smoke rose from the Kessler woods again, thicker than before, as if the forest itself had been set ablaze. When farmers passed by days later, they swore the earth still smoked, and the trees were blackened with soot. A handful of men gathered courage to confront the Kesslers. They petitioned for a formal investigation. But when officials arrived from Harrisburg, the parish intervened. The priest vouched for the family, the townsfolk were silenced by threats, and the papers mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse. The investigation closed before it began. Mill Forge's reputation as a pious community outweighed the truth. The Kesslers stood smiling at Sunday Mass, untouched, untouchable. Evil had woven itself into the very fabric of law and faith. And then, in 1831, the Kesslers were gone. Their home stood empty, doors unbarred, coffins scattered unfinished across the floor. Food rotted on the table. A lantern still burned in the cellar. But the family had vanished without trace. Some believed they fled to another state to begin again under new names. Others whispered they retreated underground, into tunnels beneath the funeral home that no one dared explore. A farmer claimed he saw them walking into the woods one dawn, hand in hand, chanting softly as though in prayer. None ever returned. After their disappearance, Mill Forge rotted from within. Families moved away, the church collapsed from scandal, and the town dissolved into ruins. Visitors reported strange happenings in the abandoned funeral home. Lamps flickering without oil, children's laughter echoing in the halls, a woman's voice singing hymns no one recognized. Excavations in the cellar revealed chains fixed into the stone floor, pits of ash, surgical tools coated in rust and marrow, and beneath one slab, a cavity filled with skulls. More than 50 stacked as though arranged for display. The truth was undeniable, yet too monstrous for history to record. Today, Mill Forge is a ghost on the map. Its church is a husk, its graveyard overgrown, its funeral home collapsed into earth. But locals whisper that if you wander too close, you will hear the sound of iron doors creaking beneath your feet, and voices humming in a language you should not recognize. The Kesslers were never tried, never punished. Their names were erased from official record, scrubbed as if they never existed. But history is not merciful. It remembers in shadows. And in the silence of Pennsylvania's forgotten hills, the funeral home of horrors still waits, holding secrets the living were never meant to know.